this is the Jupyter Notebook environment. It is a mixture of words or text and code. It's divided into cells. These cells that have text are markdown cells. They're what is called markdown cells. And then these cells that have this square bracket next to them are what we call code cells. And so if we type things into these cells, they are Python code. And then when we press Shift and Enter on our keyboard at the same time, so we press Shift and Enter, Python is going to run whatever is in those cells as code. So any Python interpreter at its simplest level works just like a calculator. So if we type 3 plus 7, we see that the answer is 10. We could change this if we wanted. We could do something like 3 plus 12, and it's going to give us our answer. So that itself is not that interesting, but where Python starts to be more interesting is when we do things like assign variables. So we've got an example in this notebook. We have a variable named amount, an equal sign, and then what we're assigning to that name. So this is called variable assignment in Python, and the syntax is variable name equals variable value. And then here I have a hashtag and then the word moles. And so this is what is called a comment, and this is for people only. So this is just a note to myself, and the Python interpreter is going to actually ignore that, but that's just there for me to remember that this amount is in moles. I also have a variable here called volume, and I've set that equal to liters. And then if I click inside the cell and press Shift and Enter, it's going to execute that code. I don't see anything that has been output from this cell, but I know that it ran because a number appeared over here in the square bracket. So it showed me 3, that it counts the order that they've run in. And then once I've defined my variables, I can do things like perform calculations. So if I have an amount in moles and I have a volume, I could, for example, calculate a molarity by dividing the amount by the volume. So that's going to give me moles per liter. And so if I click inside this cell and press Shift and Enter, it's going to calculate that for me. And then here you'll notice that it has output something. And that's because I put the variable as the last thing in the cell. So sometimes it can be confusing on why sometimes you'll see a value and sometimes you won't. Here we're seeing an output of 0.2 because this variable is the last thing that's present in this code cell. I could comment this out. So let's see what happens if I comment this out. And so here I've just put like a hashtag in front of the variable name, and that's telling Python to just basically ignore this line. And then I'm not going to get an output. Okay. I'm just going to delete this again. I can run it and then see the output here. Okay, let me bring up my participants list. And I'll remind you if you, I'm going to clear the feedback, but I'll remind you if you're having any troubles, put up your red X and someone will help you. All right, so that is sort of some basics that were covered in part 1. Another important concept from part 1 that I want to remind you of are data types. So in Python or in any programming language that you use, each variable that you have has a particular data type. And the types of data that we see pretty often are string, which represents words, floating point number, which represents decimals, or integers, which represents integers. Anytime you're confused about what data type a variable is, you can find out by using a function called type. And then we would type the word type, then put parentheses and then the variable name. If I call type on molarity, I'm going to see that it's a floating point number, which we would expect because we see the decimal here. And we can also define strings or words using quotations. So if I want to define a variable called units that has a word that tells me what my units are, then I can put quotes and then I can type moles per liter. And then once I call type on units, I'm going to see that it is a string. Okay, so I want to cover something that we're going to be using called a formatted string. This was covered in the previous webinar as well, but it's going to be important today for the analysis that we're going to be doing. So we want to make sure that we cover it again. I'll pause here. So if you are with me, can you use a green check mark, please? Great. Good. Okay, so we are going to be using a formatted string. And a formatted string is something that allows us to put variables inside of a string, and we can use that to print information about really anything that we want. So let's say we wanted to print information about like what our concentration is. We're going to define a string that contains variables, and we're going to define a string that contains variables. So I'm going to create a variable here called myString. And then to create a formatted string, you start with an F, and then you put quotes. And I usually just put both of my quotes at the same time, and then I use my arrow key to go back and I type in between. And so I'm going to write a string that says the concentration is, and then I'm going to put in my molarity variable. So I could do that. So we're making a string called myString, and we're printing the molarity. And then I'm going to print myString. And it's going to print the concentration is 0.2. And then maybe I want to also print the units. So I'm going to put the units in as well. So I'm going to use this formatted string to insert my variables into the string. Okay, so now if I print, I get the concentration is 0.2 moles per liter. Okay, very important to note about this. So I use here these, I call them squiggly brackets. So using those squiggly brackets lets you put variables in your string. Very important to note, if you do not put this F, let's say that we wanted to do a formatted string, but I forgot the F, then it's going to literally print what I have in the string. So the F is very important. We're going to be using this formatted string in some of our analysis. So for example, to maybe annotate some plots that we're going to be making. Okay. Another thing that was covered last time that I want to remind you of is a data type called a list. So a list is a data structure that can be used to group several values or variables together. And their lists are made using brackets, and then you put values that you want in your list separated by commas. So here I've made a variable called amounts. I've set it equal to a list with these values. And then I made a mistake here. So this is for everyone. I made a mistake here. I want everyone to change the value in length here and change it to amount. So this reminds us of how we create a list using square brackets. It also reminds us of this length function we can call len on a list to get the number of elements in the list. And now let's use a print statement here with our formatted string printing to print the length of the list. So I have defined a list called amounts. I've defined a variable called num_elements. Now I'm going to print the length of the list. So I'll do print, and then I'm going to use F, and then I'm going to open and close my quotations. And then I'm going to type the length of the list is, and then I'm going to use my squiggly braces and put in num_elements. And then I have to remember to close my parentheses for my print function. And that's going to print, type amounts here and not amount. So now you should get the length of the list is 5. So that's just demonstrating a list, demonstrating the length function as a reminder, and then using this new printing syntax that we learned with formatted strings. If you are with me, can you use a green check mark, please? Okay, so I think most people are with us. And then I'll just do a quick poll. Is this text size okay for everyone, or does it need to be bigger? Okay. Is this good size? Okay, we'll go with this one. All right, so that is a list. I realize that this primer is going pretty fast. The assumption is that we've seen most of it before, so my apologies if it seems a little fast. Okay, so that was a list. Also, to remind you about lists, we can do something called slicing or indexing, where we get particular values from the list. So in Python, counting starts at 0. When we have a list, we can get a particular item by using the list name, then square brackets, then the number of the list element that we would like. And so if we wanted to get the first element of the amounts list, we would use the word amounts, then square bracket, and then the number. So we can do amounts square brackets 0 to get the first element, which we expect to be 0.1. So let's see that. Okay, we can get the second one by using 1. So that's the first is 0. The second is 1, because in Python, counting starts at 0. And then I want to show you a cool trick. This is first. And we're not going to see anything. We're not going to see this one, but if you want to get the last one, this is a cool trick. You can do actually amounts. Python will let you do negative. We can do amounts to -1 to get the last one. Okay, so that's a reminder of indexing. And then we can also do something called slicing that allows us to get a smaller list. And here we have a start and an end. So let's say I want to get the first 2 elements of amount. I'm going to put the list name, then I'll put my starting index, and then a colon, and then my ending index. And for the end, it's going to go up to, but not including the ending index. So if I want to get first 2, I'll have to do amounts, square bracket, 0, colon, and then we're actually going to go to list index 2 because it goes up to that index, but not goes up to, but not including that index. So I can print the first 2, and I have 0.1 and 0.2. Okay. I'll remind you of for loops. So we have for loop is something that we also covered in the first session that you'll be using today. and then logic statements. And then we have a new topic that we have to cover called Python dictionaries. That's going to be really important today. So I'm going to go over for loops pretty quickly and if statements pretty quickly so that we can talk about dictionaries. So oftentimes in Python, you'll want to do something to every element of a list. And if you want to do that, you're going to use something called a for loop. So this is the general structure of a for loop. We have for, and then we have a variable name, and you make this up. It can be anything that you want it to be. And then you give the list name. Then you put a colon. And then if you're using something like Jupyter Notebook, it's going to indent for you automatically. So here you'll see that there is a space here. It's going to insert that. That's very important in Python. And then you're going to type whatever you want to do with your variable under that for loop. So if we wanted, just to show you how this works, let's say I'll make something that loops through my amounts list. I'll say for value in amounts. And then what I'm just going to do is print value. When I do this, what's going to happen is it's going to go through our amounts list. It's going to fill in 0.1 to value first. Then it's going to fill in 0.2, and it prints it each time. So this is what you would use if you want to do things many times, or you want to do something to everything in a list. So let's do something a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to do for value in amounts. And then I'm going to do a calculation. I'll calculate a concentration. So for every amount that I have in my list, I want to calculate the concentration. And I'll say that it's equal to value divided by volume. And if you remember earlier, we had defined a variable called volume. So we're just going to use that volume to calculate the concentration for every value. Okay. And then I could print each concentration as I calculate it. So here it's going to take in each one, and then it's going to divide by our volume. Okay, and then this is still review from what we covered last time. Often what we'll want to do is to save these values that we've calculated to a new list. So we'll create a variable called concentrations, and I'm going to set that equal to an empty list. And then I'm going to take this for loop. I'm just going to copy it. I'll paste it here. And then I'm going to do something called appending. So I'm going to append my calculated value to my empty list. And this is going to build a new list of concentrations for me. And then at the end, I'm going to print my concentrations list. So here I've created an empty list called concentrations. I'm looping through every value in my list of amounts. I'm calculating a concentration using a volume that I've defined, and then I'm appending that calculated value to the list I created. Then at the end, I'm going to print all of the concentrations that I have calculated. Okay, so I'm going to execute this code I've written, and then it's going to show me my list of concentrations that I calculated using my for loop. Okay. I'm going to actually skip because we didn't have much time budgeted for the primer. I'm actually going to skip the logic statement and then tell you about the dictionaries, and then we'll be done with our Python primer and we'll move on to our new material. But a data structure that we didn't introduce last time that's going to be very important in this workshop is something called a Python dictionary. So a Python dictionary is similar to a list in that it's a collection of data. So for a list, it allows us to group many values together. A dictionary is also going to allow us to group many values together. But the unique thing about a dictionary is it allows us to define a keyword that can be used to look up that value. So if you think about the way that you use like a real dictionary, you're like, I want to know the definition of this word. You open your dictionary, you go look for that word, and then it tells you the definition. Here, it's a similar kind of thing. We're going to define names and then essentially kind of what their definition is, and then we can look up what that definition is by name. So here, the syntax for that is we create a variable name. This is just like pseudocode to show you, let's say it's called dictionary name. Then we use the squiggly brackets. And I know this can be confusing because we've already used the squiggly brackets in F-string printing or formatted strings. But here, when we're defining a variable, that means that we're defining a dictionary. And then we put in quotes, or you can also use numbers here, but most of the time it's going to be a string. You give it a name, and then a value, then a comma. And then if we want to define something else in our dictionary, we do another key name, then a colon, and then the value. So if that's a little abstract, let's think about it if we wanted to do something like make a dictionary of amino acids, molecular weights. So we've started a dictionary here called amino acids. We've set that equal to, we use the curly braces. And then here we have the 3-letter code for alanine, a colon, and then this is the molecular weight of alanine. Same thing, this is arginine, a colon, and then the molecular weight of arginine. So I'm going to click inside of this cell. I'm going to press Shift and Enter to execute it. It's going to look like nothing happened, but I know that it executed because of this number. But then what I can do is I can type my dictionary name, then I use square brackets. Then notice here, instead of using a number like we did with a list, I now use this name. So I can use ALA or ARG. And then if I execute this, it's going to tell me what the value is that is associated with that key. So it's essentially like looking up what we've defined ALA to be in our dictionary. So that's the main idea with the dictionary. If I wanted to add more entries to this dictionary, I could click inside of this cell. I'll go to my last entry, I'll put a comma, and then I'll just add in what I want to add. So let's say I want to do ASN, and then I can type that, so the 3-letter code. Then I'll type whatever the value is, which I happen to know it's 132.12. I can do it for, I think this is aspartic acid. I'm not a biochemist. ASP is 133.11. So let's say we go with that. I'm going to execute this again just so I have those new values. And then I could use those names to look up those weights. So you can imagine what usually you're going to do is have a dictionary, and you can use it to pull information out of. And you can also loop over the dictionary so that you can do things with both the name of this and the value associated with it. So if we have a dictionary, we can see all of the keys. So all of these strings here are called keys. And then what's associated here is called the values. So we can get all of the keys using the name of the dictionary .keys. We can get all of the values with the dictionary name .values. So I can print those. It's going to tell me that my dictionary keys are ALA, ARG, ASN, and ASP. And then it's going to tell me what those values are. So those were the keys and the values. And if you program in Python, a really common thing to do with dictionaries is to do a loop with this thing called .items. And what that's going to do is it's going to, when you use .items, you'll write for key and value in dictionary name .items. And then it's going to fill each key into the key variable and each value into the value variable. So if I execute this, I've used my formatted string It's just going to tell me for each iteration what the key is. But we could do something more interesting. So I'm going to comment this and write a different print statement. And I'll write print F, and then I'm going to do my quotes. I'm going to go ahead and close that for myself. But I could type something like the weight of, and then I can use curly braces to insert the variable is value. And then it's going to print that string for me for each dictionary item. Okay, so that's the new stuff that we wanted to cover in the Python primer. Well, it's a review of the old stuff and some new things that we're going to be using today. So we covered variable assignment. We covered lists, slicing lists, for loops, and then the things that we really wanted to emphasize this time are the formatted strings and printing variables in formatted strings, and then the dictionary. So this is a very important data type that we're going to be using a lot of for today, particularly for the MMSIF part. And a dictionary allows you to find keywords and then fill in the values for those keywords.